So a quick reminder of who you're joined by on the webinar today. So on the webinar today are the state and system partners from the Pay for Success in Higher Education National Cohort from Arizona, Colorado, Ohio, and Connecticut, as well as our 8 college access and success providers who make up the provider advisory group. And this whole group together is exploring how Pay for Success financing can be used as a way to fund wraparound student support services that improve matriculation, persistence, and graduation outcomes for underserved students. You know us by now, your third sector TA team, and this is HK speaking. And we're excited to be joined today by our special guest from MDRC, Evan Weissman, who will introduce you to in just a bit. So today we're talking about evidence and evaluation, including what are some examples that have been tested and shown to be effective in college access and success, as well as what are the implications for evidence and evaluation in shaping PFS projects. So to start, we're going to do a quick review of evidence and evaluation in Pay for Success, really drawing on what we discussed at NCAN with Rana Huckabee from Catholic Charities Fort Worth and Heather Reynolds from Leo. We'll also introduce a tool, an RFI template, which you can add to your Pay for Success toolbox along with the economic model and the term sheet. And then we'll turn it over to Evan to talk about the evidence and what he has learned in his extensive experience supporting and evaluating access and success programs. Let's dive into evidence and evaluation in Pay for Success. So as we've talked about with some of you before, there are 2 main applications of evaluation in Pay for Success. The first is measuring project progress and success. So really understanding, did the program achieve the desired outcomes? Are payments tied to those outcomes triggered? And what can we learn along the way in order to improve programs and ultimately the outcomes that they produce? And we'll talk a bit more about this with Evan as he draws on his MDRC experience. But what I first want to talk about is the second application of evaluation in Pay for Success, which is selecting a provider to deliver services. So the state and system partners on this webinar are building towards partnering with a provider. And as part of that partnership, and building towards that partnership, they'll need to look to the evidence base of previous evaluations to shape what services or components of services they ultimately procure for and which providers they select based on their track record of delivering those services and achieving those outcomes. So when we look at our simplified illustrative Pay for Success diagram that you've all now seen many times and we've tweaked in multiple ways based on the projects that you're specifically building, what we're really talking about is this relationship between the public funding entity or the systems level payer and the service provider. So after identifying their priority population and conducting a root cause analysis, many of the state and system partners on this call are building towards or in the process of number 1 here. They're really determining the program or program components that they want to procure for based on the existing evidence. And the evidence that they will be looking for or looking to and informing this might come through conducting a lit review as well as stakeholder engagement. And as part of that stakeholder engagement, really partnering deeply with providers to understand what has worked in the past and what outcomes have been achieved. And so before procuring for and contracting with a provider, they'll need to also do number 2, really decide what level of evidence is required or recommended from the providers who respond to the procurement and ultimately win the contract to be funded to deliver those services. And as we talked about at NCAN, within that level of deciding the preferred level of evidence for a provider, there's a whole spectrum. So thinking about on the low end of the spectrum, non-experimental, so what data has the provider collected and outcomes have they seen in their program with no comparison group. There's the quasi-experimental of comparing those outcomes that a provider has seen with a kind of similar group in the population. And then there's a full-blown experimental or randomized control trial where participants are randomized into the program and then outcomes are compared between those who participate in the program and those who did not. So all of that, all of those decisions in 1 and 2 go into ultimately the procurement that a state and system partner will launch, which then will solidify the relationship that they have with a provider in funding those services and the provider that's ultimately selected as part of this process. So as part of that process of selecting a provider and reflecting on that evidence base, state and system partners will really need to consider that for certain populations and for different programs, there is a lot of evidence out there. So on the high evidence end of the spectrum, there are multiple providers on this webinar today who have run RCTs on their coaching programs and have demonstrated that evidence. However, for some other populations that state and systems are interested in, such as a returning adult population, there's a much lower evidence base. So depending on the focus area, as well as what other stakeholders like an upfront funder can agree on, state and system partners will have to determine the level of evidence that they are looking for along this spectrum for a provider. So today, we want to offer a tool for state and system partners to use in partnership with providers to inform their procurements and ultimately gather input, evidence, and experience to shape those kind of number 1 and number 2 components that we talked about in building pay for success projects. So the RFI tool that I'll turn it over to Alicia to introduce will really support state and systems in both determining the programs and program components, as well as also thinking about what's their preferred level of evidence in selecting a provider. So I'll turn it over to Alicia to introduce that RFI tool to you.
Thanks, HK. I'll take a few minutes to introduce the RFI, and just to note, we'll be sharing the actual RFI tool with all of you on Friday, along with a recording of this webinar and the slides. So again, this is the 3rd tool in your toolbox, the first 2 being the economic model and the term sheet, which was just shared 2 weeks ago on the last webinar. So as you may already know, an RFI, or request for information, can be released prior to launching a formal procurement, like a request for proposals, or RFP. The main difference is that an RFI is used to solicit feedback rather than bids. The feedback gained through the RFI is useful in further shaping the project. So for those in the cohort, we've already encouraged and you've already conducted many stakeholder conversations already, but this is another way to reach different stakeholders and providers who may bring additional perspective on service models that can be then incorporated into the procurement process. Other characteristics of RFIs are listed on the left side of the screen. For example, it's non-binding and low risk because it's purely information gathering. When launching a pay-for-success project in higher ed, an RFI may be especially useful since the evidence base for student support service models is still growing. It provides an opportunity for providers to share their experience on what they have found to be effective for the priority population and the evidence that they have gathered. This can help state and system partners to hone in on the types or components of services that they will ultimately look to fund to achieve desired outcomes for their prioritized populations. In past launch pay-for-success projects, government partners have used RFIs to inform the services they ultimately fund. If you were tuned into our last webinar, you may remember the example we gave, which was Salt Lake County's Pay-for-Success initiative, which third sector was involved in, and this was a dual project to address homelessness and recidivism in Salt Lake County, Utah. In the Salt Lake project, the county released an RFI to gather information from providers about their interest in pay-for-success and what interventions they had found to be effective in the social services and criminal justice space. The RFI responses led to 3 RFPs targeting distinct areas: early childhood, recidivism, and homelessness. First Step House, which is a behavioral health treatment and housing provider that works primarily with people in reentry, responded with suggestions around both what services they had found to be effective, as well as outcome measures that they use to monitor progress and inform continuous improvement. All of this information ultimately shaped how the county built the project and the procurement, and First Step House ultimately ended up winning the procurement and participating in the program. And this program is ongoing. It's been up and running for 3 years. So to support state and system cohort sites with developing your own RFIs, we will be sharing a template. It'll be in the form of a Word document, and we've customized particular sections to apply specifically to the college access and success field and the cohort's work in particular. So sections such as the purpose of using an RFI in higher ed, the goal of Pay for Success in this context, and the key stakeholders that might be involved in a higher ed Pay for Success project. There are also sections that will be highlighted where sites can further customize the document to their specific project hypothesis. So again, this tool will be shared on Friday, and we're happy to answer questions about it on upcoming working group calls or via email, whatever is convenient. And with that, I will turn it over to Evan to introduce himself and share some lessons learned from his work with MDRC. His examples and lessons are intended to augment your exploration of the evidence in college access and success and inform your pre-procurement process of determining the services or components of services states and systems will procure for, as well as the level of evidence you may request from a provider. Evan, thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks for having me, Alicia and HK. So again, I'm Evan Weissman with MDRC. We're based in New York, but I'm actually out in our Oakland, California office. And for those of you who don't know MDRC, we're primarily known for conducting rigorous evaluations, so really learning the details of the impacts of programs on student outcomes. But we also are really focused on using that information and data to strengthen other programs and to make sure that the research is used to inform future decision-making. So it's really great to be on this call today and to know that you all are looking to research to inform the work that you're doing. What I'm going to do today is give a brief overview of some of our lessons that you see on this slide here, and then I'll dig into 3 programs in particular, 3 studies that we've done, and give the examples from that. And then at the end, I'll sort of point back to these lessons and give you a list of some other studies that might also inform your decisions around these 5 points. So the first point here that we've come across in a number of studies is that tuition and financial support are really key to helping students succeed, but they also need more. A lot of students need more than just the financial supports. Second lesson, that proactive advising and coaching can be one of the most important ones of those supports when you're thinking about non-academic supports. The third is thinking about financial incentives, not just as the overall amount of finances given to students, but how they're offered, and that by linking them to milestones, creating an incentive structure as well as a support structure can help students meet those milestones that you create. The fourth is around behavioral science and recognizing that behavioral nudges and other behavioral science techniques can really make a difference, especially in short-term outcomes, helping get students to participate and do the interim steps that you want them to do towards longer-term success. And then finally, a really important lesson is that smaller programs with focused short-term or mid-term outcomes tend to have those types of impacts, but that if what you want are longer-term impacts on student success, it's important to integrate different strategies, bring together different approaches, and then sustain those programs over time to get the long-term impacts you're looking for. And I'll give a couple examples of some of these comprehensive type programs and the longer term impacts they've had. And then just a final note, on the evidence I'm going to be talking about today, it's really around support services. The MDRC also has a body of work around remedial education, developmental education, and instructional reforms, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. This is really about the wraparound services and the additional support services outside of the classroom. So this slide here, just a couple of reminders and notes about this evidence. So I'm primarily going to be talking about MDRC studies, but there are a lot of other good studies out there as well. And I think, as HK mentioned earlier, including some studies that have been done with the providers and the provider advisory group on their actual services that they've been providing. And then also just to point back, as was mentioned earlier, the spectrum of evidence. And remember, there's the rigor of the evaluation that it's important to recognize, which isn't to say that only RCTs are important, but to recognize what's a rigorous randomized control trial versus some of the other types of studies that can give you a really good idea of impacts, but might not have as much rigor or certainty. But then also thinking about the services you're going to provide or the population you're serving and how close your match is to what has been studied. Again, knowing you're not always going to have a perfect match, but that the more overlap there is between what you're doing, the way the services are provided, how you're planning to implement the program, the closer that is to what has already been studied, the more likely it is that you'll see similar impacts. And just recognizing your impacts may vary, but it's always good to have a starting point for this. All right, so let's turn to my first example now. This one touches on a couple of those broad lessons. It's a comprehensive approach, the Detroit Promise Path. But the first thing that it does is really, this is a program that recognized the fact that scholarships alone weren't enough to help students. So Detroit Promise is a college promise program that was covering the tuition and fees for students to make sure that they could afford college. And they implemented this program and felt they were really having an impact on access, but that it wasn't enough and that students weren't persisting at the rates they wanted to see. So Detroit came to MDRC, and together we put together a program model that added extra supports on top of that tuition and fees. And that included monthly campus coaching, financial incentives that were linked to coming to meet with a campus coach. So students would get $50 each month that they came to meet with their coach. There was also a real push for summer engagement to get students either to attend classes or to help them into summer jobs. And then we created an MIS system to help track what students were doing, how they were meeting these milestones of campus coaching, whether or not they were engaged in the summer, so they could better track their students and help them through the college process. The evaluation of Detroit Promise Path is really focused not on the overall impact of the tuition, but on the impact of these services on top of tuition. So we randomly assigned about 1,200 students, where half got the full college promise and tuition, and the other half got that tuition plus these four extra support services. It's really a high poverty population in Detroit, as you would expect. And their target was students coming straight out of high school. So the average age was 18. So it's really low-income students straight out of high school who they were aiming to serve. So if we go to the next slide, what we see is the program really did have its intended effects on increasing enrollment. If you see in the first semester, enrollment impacts were not that large. It was about 5%. So students were getting the tuition. Those in the control group, the light blue, got full tuition coverage through the Detroit Promise. Detroit Promise Path, the extra services, had a 5 percentage point impact on enrollment. But if you look at full-time enrollment, that impact's a little bit larger because students were really encouraged to attend full-time and supported in doing that. And then if you look to the second semester, you see that impact grew over time. So Detroit Promise Path was having the intended effect, supporting students, helping them persist with that extra coaching and other supports. And remember, one of the components was also an encouragement to enroll in the summer. And here you see that those extra services nearly tripled the summer enrollment, where the control group had 7%, the program group had a 20% enrollment rate in the summer. As a result of this, plus the impacts on full-time enrollment, students actually earned more credits in their first year. It's not shown here, but on average, they earned about 2 credits more by the end of the first year. Okay, so let's turn to another strategy here. So Detroit Promise Path was really focused on a number of strategies with that long-term goal of college success. This example here, encouraging additional summer enrollment, or the EASE project in Ohio, had a more focused approach. It was really looking at using lessons from behavioral messaging with some small financial supports with a specific near-term goal of increasing summer enrollment to keep students engaged. So if we go to the next slide, here's an overview of the EASE program. There were about 10,000 students, so they were first-year Pell students in Ohio, and they were actually randomly assigned to 3 groups. So about a third went into the first group, which received behavioral information, so letters, postcards, emails, encouraging them using behavioral economics approaches, encouraging them to be engaged in the summer, to enroll in summer courses at the end of their first year. The second group got that as well as tuition assistance. So a lot of students are eligible for summer Pell but don't know it. This approach encouraged them to use that summer Pell but also offered additional assistance for the students who didn't have enough to cover their summer tuition. And then the third group was the control group that received the standard messaging and standard financial aid, which could include summer Pell but wasn't available for all students. So just sort of backing up, a side note about behavioral science. I've mentioned it a few times. What behavioral science approaches say, it's a recognition that people don't make sort of logical decisions all the time. We don't always do what we want to do or what we should do. I know it's true for me. A couple of months ago, I decided I was going to floss my teeth every night. It's a simple thing to do. I know it's better for me, but I don't always do it. My kids and I made a bet and sort of got ourselves flossing together, and we've all done much better now that we're doing it together. It was sort of a behavioral approach to doing something that we all know makes sense, but it's hard to do anyways. So it's recognizing here, students don't always do what they need to do. They know that you can tell them that summer is going to make a difference, going to school in the summer is going to help them complete, but just telling them might not be enough. So there are ways to think about how humans will react to messages and reframing those messages and thinking about the context as well. And this final link on this page points to MDRC's broader work on behavioral sciences. We have a center on behavioral science that has a number of studies as well as toolkits for helping shape messaging to recognize the way that students or just humans in general will react to messages. If you go to the next slide, here's one example from the EASE program of what they did to change the summer messaging. So first off, a really simple is customizing messages. Putting a student's name at the beginning makes it more likely that they're going to read the message and react to it. There's also the idea of reciprocity. So it's saying, I did something positive, now it's up to you to do something. So I took some time to review your package. Now you as a student, it's your turn to do something helpful as well. And a third thing that's in this message is the idea of loss aversion, which is that people are much more likely to act to keep from losing something than to get something new. So instead of saying you can earn up to $980, it says here you have up to $980, suggesting that if the student doesn't act, they're going to lose that money. So all of these things together, plus obviously other things and restructuring of the messaging, were put into the EASE program to see if they could encourage and get students to attend during the summer. So if you flip to the next slide, we've got an example here of the outcomes from this intervention. The bottom line there in the light blue is the control group, those that received the standard messaging and standard financial aid. About a quarter enrolled in the summer. If you go up one bar to the dark blue, you see those who got the behaviorally informed information were 32%, so almost a third enrolled in the summer. And those who got the extra information plus the tuition assistance, you see it's about 38%. So there's a real impact here just by changing the messaging or changing the messaging and adding a little extra money linked with that to getting students to enroll in the summer. If you turn to the next slide, though, this shows some of the limits of just doing the behavioral messaging. A limited program that's really focused on increasing summer enrollment had the effect that was intended of increasing the summer enrollment. But you see it didn't have an impact on persistence into the fall. So I think it's a good reminder that a small targeted intervention can have its intended effect, but that doesn't always snowball into longer term impacts. So you need to really focus on what you expect to get from an intervention. And if you want longer term impacts, think about longer interventions or bundling together different types of services to support students throughout their college careers. So if we go to the next slide, just to briefly touch on some other lighter touch approaches. And here it's really just a quick note on nudging. The next slide, pointing out that there's a growing body of research around nudges and behavioral messaging showing that they really can improve outcomes, but there's also limits to maintaining this efficacy, either in long term. You can't really expect these just to magically snowball and have longer term impacts without extra supports. And also when scaling, there seems to be limits to some of this. And I don't know if folks saw that today there was a opinion piece in Inside Higher Ed that had a nice message about not giving up on nudging and talks about the hype cycle of how nudges for a while were seen as the panacea. Lately, there have been a few studies showing that nudges don't always work, but noting it's not time to give up on them, but rather to recognize their limits and also their real effectiveness when they're used properly. So on to the last example I'm going to give. This is sort of turning back to the idea of comprehensive approaches. And this is a study that MDRC did of the ASAP program in Ohio. So the next slide, showing here the ASAP Ohio demonstration. So this is based closely on the CUNY Accelerated Study and Associate Programs. It's a CUNY ASAP model. I assume many of you have heard of this, which MDRC's study showed increases graduation rates and shortens time to degree for students. Ohio took this on with support from CUNY and others to replicate this with really two big questions. First, can colleges replicate CUNY's model? Is this something special about CUNY, or with the help of CUNY and others, can they replicate it in other settings? And the second big question then is if it can be replicated, will there be similar impacts? So the first thing we saw, Ohio was able to replicate it. They stuck very closely to the CUNY model, but also made some intentional changes, some variation based on their local context. So the model here includes 4 core components. Students were required to enroll full-time to be part of the program, and there was strong messaging supporting that enrollment, encouraging students to take their DevEd early and to graduate in 3 years. There are financial supports to help students do that. So it was a tuition waiver as well as small incentives, a monthly $50 incentive for students who met their service requirements, got those extra supports. And this is an example where in New York they give a Metro card. At CUNY Ohio, Ohio ASAP, it was a gas or grocery card. The third component, the student services, was advising that was really triaged to try to recognize which students needed the extra supports and coaching and advising, and then also tapping into tutoring and career services on campus and making sure students were taking advantage of those services. And finally, looking at course enrollment, there was an ASAP seminar, as well as trying to link courses together and give early registration to make sure students could get the courses they needed so they could continue full-time. The Ohio ASAP demonstration, it was random assignment as well. There were about 1,500 students, and a decent number of students in the population were older. So it was about 1/3 of the students were 24 or older. And as you would expect, a lot of those were employed. If we turn now to the impact findings, it was really impressive, and that what we saw is not only was Ohio able to replicate the program, but they also saw similar impacts on graduation rates, where they about doubled the 2-year graduation rates. And then if you dig in a little deeper, sort of thinking about how they doubled those graduation rates. I don't have the detailed slides here, but what they did was the program helped students enroll at higher levels by about 10% each semester. It also supported and encouraged students to be full-time, and that reached up to 20% impact in several of the semesters. So students were much more likely to be enrolled and to enroll full-time if they were in the program compared to the control group. And then finally, as a result of this increased enrollment, students increased the number of credits they earned each semester, and cumulatively that helped build up to that graduation impact. All right. So this goes back to that first slide that I spoke to about the broad lessons. And here I give a few more examples of programs that we've looked at. When you get the slides, I think on Friday, these all have links back to MDRC's site with the studies. Some of these studies don't actually have the positive impacts. They have either smaller or null impacts, but really important lessons built into those. And some of them are still ongoing, but I think they give good examples within these different categories, recognizing that students need more supports, that coaching and advising are a really important part of that. The importance of financial incentives, and there I want to point to our performance-based scholarship study, was actually a suite of studies and came with a toolkit. We have a TA guide to really help think about how to create financial incentives that can be linked to milestones to encourage success. Our behavioral science work, CABS being a whole suite of studies, as well as a couple other projects that we're doing. And then finally, comprehensive programs. In addition to Detroit Promise Path and the ASAP programs that we have studied, we have a new project called Success that's looking at sort of building on these lessons. So if you read about that, you can see some of the next steps that MDRC and some of our other projects and programs we're working with are taking. And that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to hearing thoughts and questions.
Great, thanks so much, Evan. That was a really helpful overview of some of the different programs that you've worked on and studied and the impact that those programs have achieved. And I think those program examples, as well as these other resources that you've put here, will be really helpful as sites continue to dig into what are those programs or components of programs that they'll want to incorporate in their projects and ultimately procure for, and also really thinking about the link between the services that they're procuring for and ultimately those priority outcomes that they're hoping to move the needle on for their priority populations. So really just want to open up the chat box as well as the line. Feel free to unmute yourself and jump in with questions on anything that we've talked about here today or any of the resources that are on the screen. Okay, it looks like we've got a question here from Cynthia from Colorado. She says, projects or research you suggest to review if our focus is on the adult population?
I would look at Ohio ASAP, given that they had a number of adult students there. And let me think on other examples as well. I would also open that up to others if you have examples.
I think that's a good suggestion. I know that we've talked about before how some of these programs that have been evaluated have adults in them, but there's not always a distinction in the study between who's an adult and who isn't. So really looking for studies that maybe the average age of the population is a little higher. Other questions? Yeah. From folks on the line?
Evan, this is Alicia. I'll jump in if there's no other chat box comments. I'm curious about the Ohio replication. How do you pick the core components to replicate? How do you know that those are the ones that are going to guarantee the impact?
Well, if you use all four, I think you can feel fairly confident. Again, you never know for sure if the impacts will be perfectly replicated. Choosing amongst them, though, I would look at your own student population and maybe if there's something to leave out, it would have to be because there's a part of your theory of change that suggests it's not necessary, or maybe something, a piece of the impacts you don't feel as strongly about. But they're really, that evaluation didn't test one or two components versus others. It's about the four together.
What about even in the initial setup of the Ohio replication and kind of determining what to contextualize to Ohio versus what to really replicate with fidelity to the CUNY model?
I think there, some of that was fairly easy in terms of the Metro card switching over to gas or groceries. Just because clearly in the context, they were able to recognize how to support students' transportation and other needs. A more nuanced example is around the student services and thinking about what they offered on their campuses and how they would fit in enhanced student services and coaching or advising at their colleges as opposed to at another college, which really is something that has to be contextualized and localized. And Detroit Promise Path offers an example of that as well, where they thought about coaching offered actually not by the colleges, but by the Chamber of Commerce, who hires the coaches and brings them to the colleges, puts them at the colleges to help students. But it's actually through a separate organization rather than at the college.
Thanks, that's helpful. We've got another question from Cynthia, who I see is really using this opportunity to pick your brain on some of the hypotheses and priority populations that Colorado is working on. So she asks, were there any strategies in the examples you provided that stood out or increased outcomes specifically for students of color?
I think the broad lesson there is that these interventions all had impacts across racial and ethnic groups, but not that they worked for students of color better than for other students. And for example, Detroit, the vast majority of students were students of color, so there's not even a sort of comparison group to look at, but just recognizing that it was very impactful for those students.
Other questions from folks on the phone? Feel free to unmute and jump in if you want.
Right. And actually, I'm going to loop back to the question about the adult population, something outside of our post-secondary work, but MDRC has a project called Work Advance. It is a model for pre-employment and career readiness training and occupational skills and a focus on job placement at the end that we are also now looking at. So that intervention had a positive impact on participants' employment, and including better wages. We're now looking at ways that community colleges can implement similar programs, or in fact already are implementing some of those things. So I think it's a program model that has been shown to work for adults that is something very similar to what can happen at college campuses. So again, that's called Work Advance, and it's spelled as one word. Any other questions?
Okay, well, if there are no other questions at this time, we're happy to wrap it there and just quickly preview some next steps. Again, a huge thank you to you, Evan, for really sharing your expertise and experience in this space, as well as the evidence that MDRC has built around college access and success. And for folks on the line, we really talked with Evan and MDRC about how this was intended to just be kind of a teaser to whet your appetite of, what are some of the resources and bodies of evidence that you might want to dig into more as you're approaching procurements and contracting with providers. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to speak more about these resources or have other questions that would be helpful in kind of shaping next steps for your project. Just a quick preview of what's to come for the cohort. We do have a few more webinar learning opportunities coming up. We'll continue this conversation around evidence and implications for pay for success on December 3rd when we talk about how you could potentially consider using a pilot as part of your pay for success project in order to build or augment the evidence base and really assure kind of all stakeholders that there's reasonable evidence that success will be achieved and those outcomes payments will be made before kind of launching into the full-blown pay for success project where payments are tied to outcomes. So more on evidence and evaluation to come in December. But before that, we're really excited for the next webinar opportunity that's coming up next week on November 18th. And during this time, our 4 state and system partners in the cohort will be practicing, explaining, and pitching their draft pay for success projects. And we'll be really looking to the whole group, and especially the provider advisory group, for their questions and feedback on the projects that they've been working on. So we really intend for this webinar to be super interactive and encourage you to tune in live if you can so that you can really take part in that question and feedback session. So we'll look forward to that and to talking to all of you virtually next week. And again, thank you so much for your time today, and a big thank you to Evan and MDRC for joining us and sharing their lessons learned.